back to the audience. You should be able to record from the audience, so it should be fine. All right, guys, I will get out of the way, let you guys have a conversation. So topic is essentially existence of God stuff, and begin wherever you'd like.
Hey,
All right,
Steven.
excellent. What's up, man? I didn't know Tom was a setup of blind dates, but I know we've never met before. But as I understand it, I suppose you're taking up an atheist position, I guess.
That's correct.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about that. So in my asking that question, I just kind of want to get out the way beforehand that I don't want to respond kind of aimlessly to atheism in general, or to unbelief, or to really any argument that I have sort of prior in my own mind. You know, I was talking with a friend of mine just a moment ago that typically when you have these big kind of lofty philosophical debates or theological debates, you tend to have these debates already in your mind kind of determined by this prior dialogue. And oftentimes when we come into contact with actual disagreement, we're just more responding to those prior dialogues. But anyway, so I just want to get to the particular claims that you'd be making and try not to have the debate get so big. But I was just curious to hear a little bit about your position and how exactly you qualify your atheism, if you would call yourself an atheist. Anyway.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you just said. In fact, I noticed myself as I heard in my last debate that I was indeed having preconceived ideas about someone's position, and then that definitely influences you. So I personally like a conversational style myself as an open discussion as opposed to a debate, but we can challenge each other's ideas and let's see where we get at. So my atheism is actually a refusal to play an impossible game. So what I mean is that I see that all the people in the world have different ideas when they think about God. They're creating these imaginary rules, believing testimonies of certain people, and they have a certain lifestyle. And I don't see a reason to think that any one of them are more likely to than the other. What makes it even more suspicious, and what makes me even more suspicious and skeptical of these claims, is that everyone is just as confident in their truth than the other. Like if you look at William Lane Craig, he's super confident, right? He's a great debater. But if you look at Zakir Naik on the other end in the Islamic world, like he's just as confident, right? And both of them are sort of like using arguments to come to completely mutually exclusive conclusions. So I think this is an impossible game. No matter how you can spend your entire life in trying to understand, but you could still be on a wrong path and not realize it. So I just refuse to believe that I should take these claims seriously. Now, that's not to say that I don't think that a God could exist. I mean, the God hypothesis could very well be true, but I take an agnostic position in that whether I can know that. And my atheism is basically, I don't have any valid reason to believe one way or the other, because the reasons that are being presented by any one of these theists are sketch at best, I feel. So what are your reasons? Let's try to see if yours are convincing.
That's actually I think a fascinating observation that you made. So I think one thing, because I don't want to approach this so much as a theist in the sense that I'm going to present you with like a philosophical skeleton, and hopefully you can kind of inflesh the ideas that hopefully result in a kind of Christianity. I think first and foremost, I want to get out the way that that the bulk of this debate isn't going to rest in metaphysics or in settling certain philosophical jargon that could lead us in one direction over the other. So for me, I think it's encouraging to observe that we're not so much concerned with the question, does God exist? For me as a Christian, it's asking that question is almost as if there is some doubt about the matter. So I'll just be charitable in saying that, I could meet you on your terms and we could start from an area of doubt. But for me, I think you've interestingly pointed out how the God hypothesis might still very well be the case, but now we're concerned more so with the matter of the possibility of my relation to the idea in question, right? So I think I would push you a little bit further that, maybe it's not an atheism per se that you're promulgating, but more so has to do with certain barriers that are in the way of you coming to a possible belief in God.
I would like to put it in a way that the epistemology. Like there has to be some way to know if this proposition is true or not, right?
Sure.
And I feel that the naturalistic explanation is better in all terms, really, to explain whatever we see. Now, as you mentioned, that is that atheistic? I don't know. I mean, I'm not an etymologist to define as to what words mean. But if you ask me, what I mean by that is, I don't believe there is a God. And if I have to believe there is a God, then I have to be presented with compelling evidence. Now, what is compelling is, again, could be, I've had people who've told me that, I'm a Catholic because my grandfather told me, that Catholicism is the best religion. And that's enough for some people, So is that evidence? I don't know, not for me. So it has to be, I have to explore and see what convinces me.
Yeah, but see, to me, that's what's so strange about the whole evidence conversation, because when we resorted back to the issue of, well, does God exist? And if we settle that question, well, then we still haven't really settled the matter as to how our own lives relates to that existence in question. And so the kind of knowledge I think is that would be afforded to us, even if I were to convince you that God exists and you're convinced of the evidence, that still doesn't necessitate you appropriating that knowledge to a relationship by which you lay down your life, or you love other individuals, or you appropriate certain guilts and shames in light of this faith, this new knowledge that you've been given. So
let's put it this way. If
sure.
If there is some way to separate our concepts or our imagination from what exists in reality, if there is some methodology to achieve that, I think like that would count as evidence. Because let's say if I say, let's say if we observe a phenomena in the natural world, right? Let's say lightning, and there are two people who looked at this lightning, and one person said that, okay, it was Zeus who rained this lightning down, and the other person says like it's the Hanuman, the monkey god, let's say, who rained it down. So both are now hypotheses, right?
Sure.
So how do we distinguish like this is something that this person has just made up versus that's what the actual reason is? So how you have to present that to me, I think.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And for me, I get a lot of help from, so particularly Christian metaphysics, a lot of the a lot based on the writings of Thomas Aquinas and his views of creation, and how he talks about working from effect to cause, or working from our experience of the different material instances we see in the world, and working our way up towards divine existence. So that's one procedure of natural theology. Or we could do a top-down approach where we kind of do like an ontological argument. We could talk about whether or not the idea of God is coherent, and then work our way down to our own minds, whether or not, for example, Philosopoet says God is a existent being, not only in my own mind, but in reality as well. So there's two ways that are possible for us. So I think we can dispel of certain possibilities from the outset. So first and foremost, let's not think so particularly about what Protestants say, or what Methodists say, or what Mormons say, or what Hindus say, because that would be a bottom-up kind of approach. Whereas I think we could talk about the sort of metaphysical views of God they have in the first place. And there's only a few main contenders in that regard: monotheism, polytheism, pantheism, panentheism, and of course we could talk about other views as well. But those are the three main sort of worldview contenders out there. And I think if we can show on the basis of reason alone that polytheism, is intellectually incoherent, that pantheism is intellectually incoherent, so we could explore those arguments. But once you do those out the way, you're left really with just monotheism. And who are the main players in monotheism? Well, you have Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And so for me, that's how I kind of wrestle with the plurality issue. I'm not dealing with a million different claims as to what is spirit, who is God, is there life after death, but instead I'm examining more generally how the individual relates to the idea in question. So to me, that's what's so important here. I don't know what
I'm fine with either approach. If you want to do a ground up, look at the evidence and make a conclusion, a generalized conclusion, which would be inductive in nature, I'm fine with the analytic approach that you suggested, or deductive approach. I'm fine with either way. All I have to do is figure out if this is something just imaginary or real, whatever way you pick.
Yeah, so I think we could agree from the outset that if we're talking about the same concept, God, that is, this distinction imaginary or real isn't a real distinction. If we are talking about God, right? There's a sense. So think about the ontological argument. To me, what doesn't interest me about Anselm's argument or his observations there is so much a proof for God's existence based on the concept of God. Rather, what's interesting is that he's saying when we are thinking about God, there is a fashion or a way in which we can't help but think of him in this way. And that is as the greatest conceivable being, or that there is no greater conceivable being.
So in other words, elaborate? So what do you mean by greater?
So if we were to take an inventory of all the things that exist, or an inventory of being, we could see that that being is hierarchical, or that being can be graded by lesser or higher degrees of perfection. So things which have a more perfect participation in being. Now, in Thomas Aquinas' language, I don't want to lose so much to analytics, but things have a higher grade on this chain of being due to their imminence of activity. So, for example, the lower end of this kind of chain of being would have to do with like chemical or vegetative life. So looking at cells, plants, things which are only of reproductive or nurturing kind of nature, or vegetative nature, if you will. And then we work our way up to animalistic nature. So now we have things that could exhibit powers of... Sorry, go ahead.
Objection here is that what is your criteria of defining something that is higher level or lower? Like, why do you decide that animal is higher than the plant?
Yeah, so it has to do with this idea of imminence of activity. So in philosophy, there's this idea known as powers ontology, which basically means that we can grade certain natures relative to their act of being. So much in language because that's not important here, but looking at plants, they can exhibit certain powers of reproduction, of nurturing and self-sustaining themselves, photosynthesis and all that kind of process, but they don't have the power of locomotion. They can't walk up and move to wherever they want to go. They don't have powers of perceptual experience like animals do. So that's kind of what I was saying. So now we get to a higher degree of being where animals can exhibit locomotion. They have a reason such to a degree that they can have a perceptual experience of things, but they can't appropriate things by reason as humans can. So now we get even higher to the experience of human beings who can now
follow. I think something could be my computer is stationary, but I'm pretty sure it can do math better than an animal that can move.
You're probably right, but that's just it. The machine and the animal can only have perceptual experiences. The machine can't appropriate certain objects or ideas with the kind of intentionality that human beings can. So I guess the premise of my argument here is that man specifically...
Sorry?
You cut out, Steven. We can't hear you.
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, I can.
All right, bye, T-Jump. Yeah, so you're saying.
Anyway, so I guess if that happens again, we're just going to reschedule for tomorrow. It's just storming really bad and it came out of nowhere. But so what I was saying was that we can tell what is graded on this sort of ladder of being, if you will, based on the imminence of activity. So when we're making our way through the way, how did I explain this last time? So when we look at, I suppose, let's just start with lower natures. And why I say lower natures, it has to do with the quality of their activity. And basically, they're limited in what they can do. So vegetative life, again, just processes of reproduction, of vegetation, nurturing, photosynthesis. It's just basic imminence of activity. When you get to animals, this imminence of activity increases. It gets greater. So now we have qualities of locomotion, of perceptual experience, where they can taste and touch things. And then we get higher to the imminence of activity in man. Now we get to his capabilities of reason. And I would say, from my perspective as a Christian, he also has this possibility of experience as spirit. So man has a footing, if you will, in spiritual being as well as material being. So this goes to my view as how I think men differ from the general fare of the created order.
Um,
I don't know if that helps the question a little bit, but
yeah, it seems arbitrary the way you're defining something as higher. So, for example, first you said eminence of activity. What does that mean?
yeah. So
How much active you are?
essentially, yeah. So the quality of being tells you it's the mode of its act, or in other words, you can tell what a thing is when you know what the thing in question is for. So when I say higher or lesser, I don't mean better in a kind of arbitrary sort of grading kind of sense. This grading just has to do with what is within their potential, what potentialities are relevant to their nature. And when you go to what I'm considering the lower end of this ladder of being, you see this higher limitation on their modes of being. They're not able to make decisions for themselves. They can't have perceptual experiences like the higher orders can.
Why does it matter if someone can make the decision or not? Why is that more valuable to you?
Well, so I would say that gets up to man's experience. So his ability to reason. That is to say, he can organize ends for himself. He's not merely a biological, instinctual animal who just succumbs to perceptual, instinctual needs. He can actually love. He can know things about the world. He can have this sort of epistemological relationship, not only with his interior life, but with the exterior world, and that there's a congruence between the two. So we don't have to posit any unnecessary barriers between how a human individual knows truth, for example.
So let's say if some human being is in a coma, or let's say it's like mentally handicapped, and there is a very smart pig, would you think that the pig is higher than that person in coma?
Yeah, no. So this has nothing to do with IQ either. So this goes back to this idea of eminence of activity, or what. Another way to think about it is what possibilities are relative to their nature. So everything that exists has actuality, what it is, and possibility. But these aren't just arbitrary in things that exist. Like a rock doesn't have the possibility of getting a college degree or driving a car or anything like that. So given this distinction between actuality and possibility, these are always relative to certain orders of being, if you will. So a man is still ontologically greater in a coma than a smart pig because he has this possibility, this potentiality for reason. Just because he's in a coma or in a kind of a sleep-like, what do you call it, paralysis kind of state, it doesn't negate the reality of that possibility still being there. In other words, even the reason why we can point out the privation in the first place is because it is a lack of what would be there by nature. That makes sense.
Think I see where you're going with this, but I think you're too quick to dismiss the possibilities. Because when you say possibility, it could be possible in some possible world. So, for example, even within this possible world, you can say that a hydrogen atom has the possibility of combining with another hydrogen atom, so on, to give rise to a sun. So something like emergent properties. So you can't say that a hydrogen atom is, just by the virtue of being lesser, in your opinion, is that it can't give rise to something more emergent.
So I see what you're saying there. I think you've highlighted an important feature of things in the world, which is namely that they're contingent. So they have the possibility of being otherwise. But again, these possibilities aren't entirely arbitrary. The reason why you can even erect thought experiments or scenarios in the first place to talk about these possibilities is because they're somehow grounded already in actuality or in what is. And so I'm just saying that there's always this proportionate relationship between what a thing is and the possibilities relative to that thing's nature.
Okay, so everything that you have described, Diet, it's everything is analytical. It's all in the mind, right? How does it point to a God? Let's try to progress from there.
So as I see it, so again, I think that's a really good point you've made because I've only outlined a kind of metaphysical schema of the world. And again, that's a take it or leave it kind of issue. But for me, if we're going to see man having a kind of place in the created order, that's the kind of metaphysics that need to be in place. It's not saying that man is greater or better or anything like that, but that man exhibits a certain perfection in this chain of being. Because when you work your way up the chain and you get eventually to God, we're not saying that God is like some being among the other vast inventory of beings, but rather that God is being itself. So it's actually incorrect to say, in a sense, that God exists, because that's not really true. God doesn't have a footing in existence like we humans do, but rather it's important to say that God subsists, or rather that God is a substance who is synonymous with his own being.
Um,
I guess the way, go ahead, sorry.
I'm not catching the drift. So, so let's say, what does this entail? That God is this perfect being, right? So you're saying that all these things in the world, they have a certain higher or lesser characteristic, and eventually it culminates into this God being. So is it fair to say that God, or help me understand, can God do all the things that we can do, for example?
Yes, but not in this. God can do them, yes, in the same way we can, but more perfectly. So just because we are fallible, created intelligences, we are bound by sense perception or sense knowledge or materially instantiated ideas, whereas God has more of an immediacy with ideas themselves. So one way you can think about it is that God doesn't have a knowledge of some particular body per se, but he has a knowledge of all the ideas by which any material example could be given. So think about it like this. The idea of a lion. God doesn't have some idea of a lion with this kind of mane or that kind of length of tail or this size. But God's idea of a lion is the form of a lion. Any lion that could be conceived in mind, past, present, or future, they all exist as one in the mind of God. And now these ideas, philosophers talk about, exist perfectly within the mind of God, such that our participation in the true or in good or in recognizing what's beautiful are just participations in God's being.
Okay. So let's step down from God, for example. Let's go down to human beings. So if I have an idea in my head, what is that? So let's say I have an idea of a unicorn in my head.
Okay.
What is the implication then?
So so knowledge concerns immateriality. So whenever you have experience of something that actually exists, you abstract from the material experience. So you see it, maybe you can smell it, but from that perceptual experience, your mind, your intellect abstracts the data that makes it intelligible, that makes it knowable, and it now exists in your mind as an idea or a form, is what philosophers would call it. Now, I think we can probably agree that unicorns don't have any real being or real act in the world, so we can't abstract any intelligible data about it.
So that's the thing. Like, how do you know that they're not a real thing in some possible world?
So that's just it. It's their possibility has to be in some way based in actuality. So we can make it up. We can come up with all things in our mind because all things are definitely possible. So I concede with you in that point.
I want to
Go
assess
ahead.
that sentence. The possibility has to be based on some form of actuality. Is that what you said?
Yes, it has to be, I would say, relative to some kind of actuality. Yeah.
So, for example, maybe, and this could be an irrelevant example. Let me know what you think. So, when Egyptians were building the pyramids, let's say, there was no possibility that man could ever fly in an airplane because it wasn't there in actuality during that time.
I mean, so now I think now we're getting into a matter of like historical contingents. So again, relative. So this has to now to do with testimony, with the authorities that we trust in order to even talk about pyramids in the first place, or to talk about the people.
So that's not my point. Pyramid is not my point. So let's take any person, any human being, 5,000 years ago, and they're like, let's say we're having this conversation 5,000 years back, right?
Right.
And and I'm telling you, like, hey, it's possible for human beings to fly, and then you say that it's impossible for people to fly because it's not based in actuality, because nobody could fly at that time, right? So it doesn't make sense to me that the possibility has to be based in some sort of actuality.
So I don't see how that exactly could. So I think my point is that again, based on our knowledge at the time. So we're speaking, of course, now. It's like that's why I mentioned before. It's easy to get caught up in thought experiments and possibilities in mind because all possibilities can be explored. So I think
what you're proposing is one such possibility as well. Like I have not seen anything in your argument which is not a figment of your imagination, for example.
well, but I have. So I was talking about how you even have knowledge of things in the first place. They have to be in some way. There's only two things possible, right? When it comes to you knowing something, you can either have a perceptual experience of it. So in other words, it's as if you saw me off in a distance over a hill, and you could make out by virtue of your being able to see, you have a reasonable degree of sense cognition, but you don't have knowledge of me because you haven't been able to directly abstract the intelligible data of what you're perceiving. So you have two possibilities. You have perception and knowledge, or perception and understanding, if you will. And
Perception and understanding.
Yeah, so there's nothing
Okay.
there's nothing in the human mind, in the human intellect, which did not arrive there through sense perception.
Mm-hmm.
If it was perceptual experience, or if it was something of an immediate knowledge experience, it has to be grounded in that initial sense perception. And how can we abstract intelligible data about something that has never been experienced, or that has never been perceived through sense
So
experience?
let me steelman your position. So basically, what you're saying is we observe a phenomena through our senses, which is the empirical understanding. So that's the phenomena, and there is this noumena. We don't know the nature of the ontology of what we're sensing, right? So it's like I'm facing a certain direction, and I sense a wind. I sense some blowing in my ear from behind. Now it could be like the wind blowing, or it could be like some of my friend blowing in my ear, so I don't know what that is. I can only sense what has like there is a wind behind, but the ontology of that thing, or other the reason or the cause, I wouldn't be able to tell what that cause is, right?
So I don't agree with that, and that's because first and foremost, I don't agree to that split that there's a phenomena and a noumena kind of existence, because already I think modern philosophy, particularly Kant, succumbs to that error of suggesting that there's this split or this rift or this antithesis that exists between our experience and our world of mind, if you will. And I don't think that we have to posit any unnecessary kind of distinctions in that way.
So if I feel a phenomena, right, then how can I know what the ontology of that phenomena is? You're saying that you can tell. It seems to me that you're saying that we can tell what the ontology is. Like for all I know, we could be a brain in a vat, for example, right? I could be in a simulation right now. So how can you even make a claim about that ontology, the fundamental nature of reality, which you seem to be doing, just based on a purely analytical or purely imaginary or conceptual analysis of the ontological argument?
And I think one thing that's probably separating us is this degree of probability, because there's a difference between a belief being possible and a belief being probable. I mean, we can explore all possibilities. I mean, we can succumb to that same kind of rift that Descartes was getting at with, the idea of the evil demon deceiving me and thinking that I exist. It's definitely a belief we could explore. But if I don't have any prior probability for thinking that belief is true, I'm almost at like an epistemological ease to not be obligated to explore that. I mean, you don't have to, you know what I mean?
Okay, that's fine. So you're okay with some sort of epistemological uncertainty. So would you be able to say that you don't know for certain that God exists? What, 100% certainty?
I think it's an ill phrasing of the question, because I don't view my.
So correct me.
So I definitely have a knowledge of God, but it's not the.
Do you have infallible knowledge of God?
No, I don't. No one does.
Okay, so that means that you have fallible knowledge. That means it could be possible that God doesn't exist. At least whatever that tiny possibility is.
No, I don't think that's what it entails. I think if we're going to think about God, we cannot think about him having this quality or this kind of feature of his existence of possibly not being. See, we have the possibility of not being. Nothing about us is necessary. In fact, nothing in the created order in our world of things, of material, natural explanations, these have the possibility of not being. But once we get to this idea of God, he cannot have this possibility.
Okay, so let's explore the ideas of God. What are the properties of this God that you say is not is necessary. I think that's what you're getting at. It's a necessary being.
So
It cannot not be, right?
Correct.
Okay.
So I think at this point, there's a usual temptation to go down, the scheme of the omni attributes, right? So we could talk about how God is all knowing, God is all powerful, and perhaps we could explore the ways in which, whenever our understanding tries to rub up against how it is these various attributes operate in God, we could raise objections to them, right? I mean, it just seems like a normal procedure of examining a philosophical idea.
I think like what I'm willing to grant is that there is something necessary to the fundamental nature of reality. There are some things that we sense in the world. There are some phenomena that we observe, and we have fallible knowledge. To the best of our knowledge, we can, we have the scientific method, etc. We have conceptual evidence, we have empirical evidence, and so on. And then we try to understand the world in a certain way. But it's completely possible. But what is the ultimate fundamental nature of reality? It must be what if it's a necessary nature, for example, like a pantheism, like you mentioned earlier? How do you distinguish between what the ontology is, whether it's a pantheistic God or whatever the definition of your God is?
Yeah, so I would say first and foremost, just me taking up the shoes of a philosopher, I think that's definitely possible and can be done. We can address the metaphysical points back and forth, but I just want to make sure just that we're superseding this kind of usual conversation that happens among evangelists and apologists that, this idea, if it is true, is the most important thing about human experience or human life itself. And so I just want to make sure that even if I were to supplant satisfactory sort of answers to whatever objections you might raise, that therefore, if they're answered, that you'll align your life with this thing in question. Does that make sense?
Yes. So this is the way I look at it. Okay, and let me know if my position is unreasonable, right?
Sure.
So you're positing, like you're imagining that there is this God, and you're saying that it exists in reality, right? And this God apparently has some properties, right? And then if I cannot know this possibility of this ontology? So for the way I see it, it's possible that there could be a naturalistic pantheism, or a pantheism, or a conscious pantheism, or a God. And I don't think I have the tools or capability even, or none of us do, unless you convince me otherwise, is that we can even know the ontology of these things.
Yeah. So I think I would first and foremost clarify that we can't have an immediate knowledge as to the essence of God. So you can't really have a philosophical knowledge of God in the sense of like a Cartesian certainty or anything like that. I don't think that's not possible, simply because God cannot be a kind of perceptual experience. No one has that kind of immediacy with God. So that's not undercutting Christian belief or religious belief to a kind of agnosticism or anything like that. I'm just trying to dispel the illusion that I would take it that knowledge of God is merely an objective knowledge or an object knowledge, that instead knowledge of God more immediately pertains to a relationship between subject to subject, or a subjective relationship.
Yeah, could you explain that a little bit? What do you mean by relationship with God?
Yeah. So there's a lot of ways I think I could explain it, but for me, I think the best way is that you recognize that you are a self before God. And so first and foremost, I would clarify that it's a relationship between two individuals, between person to person, or personality relating to personality. So we could talk about polytheism, for example. The reason why I think that's a problem is because if we're talking about this notion of God, just based on notion alone, or concept or idea alone, God being the supreme being, if we're suggesting that there is more than one supreme being, then there must be a property which one God lacks over the other. And so this lack between the two seems to negate the very title of supreme being that one of them possesses. So just in my mind, it doesn't seem to be logically coherent that there be a polytheistic conception to reality. It just seems self-referentially incoherent. And then I think about pantheism as well, in suggesting that uncreated intelligence, that's God, and created intelligence, that's us, are somehow one, because we experience evil, we experience suffering and privations, and we experience pain. And what does it mean to talk about the perfection of God if God can experience suffering, evil, or pain in this kind of way.
Yeah, so I don't think pantheism would conclude that. I think like we could just postulate something like an all-powerful nature, and then everything else being an emergent property, or not everything else, but us being an emergent property of that nature.
So it
That's a
seems
completely coherent idea.
so that might seem something even along the lines of like a kind of Neoplatonism or a kind of mysticism, an idealism that, maybe perhaps we are just ideas in the mind of God, and that, along the way of history, we are just realizations or emanations of that.
So that's the thing. Like you went back again to the idea of God. We being an idea in God's mind, but nowhere did I postulate God. We can just grant an all-powerful nature, which is the fundamental nature of reality, and then we are just emergent properties of that nature.
Well, yeah, perhaps
Right.
we wouldn't have.
We don't
Perhaps we
need to
wouldn't have to
postulate
call
that.
it. Yeah, perhaps we wouldn't. Perhaps we wouldn't have to call it God. But then I would explore a little bit with you. What is this all-powerful nature? What are its properties? And then, I think eventually you would get to a God-like concept.
What are the properties? I mean, it's just the uncreated, necessary being. That's it. I don't know what the properties of this thing is, because the epistemology, just like we can't know the nature of God, can we? I don't know if I can know the nature of this fundamental reality. At least I don't. But for you to postulate another ontology on top of something we already know, we already know that nature exists, right? So that's one ontology of the fundamental nature of reality. Now, to postulate another one on top of that, something like an all-powerful God, it's unnecessary. I feel it's not parsimonious.
And there's a sense in which I agree with you. I think that, again, this is an unnecessary split on behalf of modern philosophy to suggest that there's a rift between nature and supernature. That's not my kind of conception of the created order as opposed to uncreated being. So I think what I'm getting hung up about more so is like, because I think you've been listening to me long enough to know that, like, okay, I have a pretty analytical answer in place of these questions and these objections, and maybe perhaps they're maskings of not being able to really explain in serious, honest terms what these problems are. Maybe that's a possibility. And so for me,
it's possible that I don't understand some of these terms as well. So
that's important as well. But again, for me, I kind of want to be in your shoes. I don't want to trick you or be clever with these terms in the sense that, like, I exhibit a kind of intellectual superiority or anything like that. I don't want to pride myself on the assumption that, like, I know better in the area of the things of God, and that only if I lifted you up to these better things that you too would be a theist or a Christian or anything like that.
Right. So let me make it simple. Let me just simplify the position of what I mentioned earlier. Is that, so from where I see, there are things in reality that I can sense, and there are things in my imagination that I can imagine, and they don't necessarily correspond. So, for example, I can imagine unicorns and gremlins, but I don't see them in the world, right? Or I can't observe them in the world in some way. So, or there is no precedence of someone observing these things. So, from where I see a difference between my imagination and reality. And then when I talk to someone else, like you or anybody else, and they also have the ability to imagine something, and then the challenge is to show that this, whatever it's in their head, is existing in the reality, right? So Tom Jump gives the example of the mirage. I think I like that example. Is that everyone is seeing this mirage, but it could be an ocean, right? It could just be an illusion. So how do we make sure that this is something that actually exists in reality, that this mirage of the ocean? So we try to look at it from different angles, right? And so on. So that's how you build your epistemology, is that, okay, let's try to know God the other way, right? Like, so a lot of people know God from praying to God, or, doing zikr. I don't know what it's called in Christianity, but, the repetitive chants that they do. So these mystical ways of trying to understand God. But I have tried all of those, actually. So I don't know whether I can even have a relationship, as you mentioned earlier, with this being. And my rejection is based on that, and I don't think my position is irrational.
No, I appreciate that honesty. I'm curious if you could tell me a little bit further, though, about, so were you raised believing in God or something to that effect?
Yes, yeah. I come from a Muslim I'm a former Muslim. I come from a fairly religious family, I would say. Not extremely religious, but above average for sure. And over time, I had a lot of questions. I was always told from the beginning, like I read the Quran when I was around 12 or 13 something, because you're forced to read from where I come from early on in your life. And then I used to go to Islamic school as well. The problem is we in India are actually taught to just parrot the sounds of the Quran. We're not actually like I could read things from the Quran. Like for example, Allahu la ilaha illahu Allahul qayyum la ta'khudhuhu sunatun wa la nawm. I can make these sounds, but I don't know what I'm saying. You know what I'm saying? So that's how we are trained to just read it in Arabic, which I think a lot of Muslims criticize themselves. Like this is not the right way to teach people. But I think they say that there's you have to pray in Arabic, and it's a superior language, etc. But then I had questions about that too. Like, what is so valuable about just parroting some sounds? Why is God getting so pleased with this thing? So it didn't make any sense. And then you had all these rules for like, you should put your right leg in when you enter the house. You should put your left leg in when you go to the restroom, and so on, so forth, and genies and whatnot. So I used to play chess. I still play chess, and I play music. And those both were told to me that they were haram. Some people say that they're not haram, but there's a lot of diversity in thought in Islamic culture as well. But then
Now, what is haram exactly? Forgive me.
Sorry?
Pardon my interruption. What is haram exactly?
Haram?
Yeah.
Oh, it's forbidden. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry. I figured, but I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. So it's forbidden to play chess, and I didn't understand that either. I was just like a good kid trying to play chess, learn chess. I used to like it. So apparently, like it says that they say that it wastes a lot of time, which you could spend in praying. So I got all these answers which didn't make sense. And then the final nail in the coffin was the problem of hell, where two of my best friends are Hindus, and those are the worst creatures according to the Quran. Like it says it, and they're going to go in hell. And this idea just made me completely unintuitive as to why these really good people would go to hell. So this God definitely is not wise when he's like being so petty about beliefs. So that's my story basically.
Yeah. No, see that provides a lot of, I think, important context because, well, first and foremost, I don't actually know a whole lot. I won't say at all, but I don't know a whole lot about Islamic theology or teachings or practice or culture. And so I think that actually takes a big chunk out of, I think, my effectiveness in this conversation. Because again, as I mentioned when we first started, I want to address you as you are or as you present yourself. And so I'm not so interested to address the objections that have resulted from those experiences. I'd rather look at those experiences and reorient this conversation again of possibility of a relationship.
So here's the thing. A lot of people would say that, okay, this is not any good reasons to reject Islam because you were just taught incorrectly, or your culture affected you in a certain way. That doesn't disprove the God of Islam. And I agree. It doesn't disprove Allah, or it doesn't disprove Jesus, or whatever that God is. But the thing is, for me to do the most honest thing would be to unlearn everything that was forced upon me as a child, to unindoctrinate myself and then assess the truth. So that's what I'm doing. So the most honest position to take would be agnostic, to reject everything that I was indoctrinated with and think for myself. So God could very well exist, but I'm willing to analyze some of these arguments for God.
Yeah, no, it's tough. I think, I mean, just being me, like being honest personally, I could be in a position where I try to work by way of arguments to get you to a certain position, but I think the biggest difference between me and you is not really an intellectual difference, but more has to concern with this matter of the will. Because, for example, as me a believer, there's this kind of this readiness for me to respond to objections you might have, or you'll even say something that'll just have me react in such a way where, I'm acting on behalf of this kind of God consciousness that I have. Mm-hmm. And so what I notice in people that just don't disagree with me, atheists, or even just you, for example, is that we don't share that similar kind of God consciousness. And now, how do you put it there? Do I just give you an argument? Do I give you reasons for why I think it's so? Maybe it'll inspire you to go some direction. I don't know. But I think
Right. And then I would
go
argue
ahead.
that if God really wanted me to believe, I mean, he could just say be and it'll be, right?
Well, why do you think that?
Because he's all powerful. And if he really cares about something like that, then he would give me some sort of. So here's the thing: everyone thinks differently, right? Everyone's epistemology is different. Some are more skeptical than the others. But God would know what it would take for me to believe. So I think like it should be very straightforward for him.
Yeah, I think, but again, so Eddie, that guy you were talking to, I think it was in May, however long ago that initial, I watched that debate and I noticed you brought that same question up. And I would say a couple things, but he made a point that's, a common sort of response, which is that kind of exposure or that revealing of God, let's say to all individuals, independent of their cultural, whatever background, it would be some kind of imposition on free will. But I think the thrust of that response is because Christianity is contingent upon a kind of relationship, a free relationship between two persons, and I don't see it as a good thing for God to just enable us to see the good in that relationship and just pursue it because we're like spiritual puppets, if you will. So I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
free.
I do see a point, but like there's problem with that view is there's problems with that view is does God, do you think God interferes with our nature at all? Like why do people pray then?
I think God interferes with our nature. I would
Yeah,
say
like
no.
if he's tinkering with the world, then he's playing with the free will, or at least he's creating circumstances in the world which can affect your free will.
I would say so to a degree. Yeah. Like we have free will, but it's certainly limited. There's a sense in which I assert the radical independence of God's reality from ours, but at the same time, there's this dependence that we have upon him. So I don't subscribe to a kind of determinism where, God says, and then therefore free will has to get out the way. But there's a sense in which God has total and complete actual knowledge of what's past, present, and future. And so our even ideas of not yet, or hasn't happened yet, or of the future, those are all meaningless distinctions to God.
So I think like that proposition is renders free will impossible, really. If God knows everything past, present, and the future, because if he knows that, let's say I'm going to lose my job, for example, then there is nothing, no amount of hard work that I can do to change that fact because God's knowledge is infallible.
Yeah. So I thought Eddie brought up again the same other kind of point that to respond that because God knows something, it doesn't necessitate that his knowing bring about or that his knowledge be causal in a
Yeah,
necessary kind of way.
and I agree. Like God could be just a bystander, just observing. He's not influencing me or anything. But the fact that he knows what I'll choose means it's determined. Whether it's determined by God or not is irrelevant. I am determined by the laws that he created or the circumstances that he created. So yes, it is still true, even though he's not actively making me choose. He created the circumstances in which he has that knowledge, that infallible knowledge. And I think, like Eddie's point, when Eddie made the point, I forgot to challenge his position. Is that yeah? I didn't mention this point. Is that it's irrelevant whether God is interfering or not, or God is causing me to do this or not. God created these circumstances.
That you're saying that's your position. Like,
No, that's what the logical conclusion of. So God created the universe. God created the world. He put me in this universe, and then he's just He's just a bystander, and he knows everything what I'm going to do. So there has to have been some point before he created me, or before that future arrives for me, where he doesn't know. So, oh, sorry, Eddie said that he actualized this world. Yeah, I remember now. Eddie mentioned that
right.
there were all these possibilities out of which he knows what path I'm going to take, and he actualized that possibility. So if you could take that position, there would have been some point in time where God didn't know what I would do. And only after he knew what I'm going to choose, then he created this actuality, right? So then that renders God not omniscient.
I guess let me try and think how I could kind of phrase this issue. I have some notes here. Hang on. Okay. So the way I would think about God's knowledge, I mean, we can just address this issue kind of quickly and go into other kind of questions.
Yeah,
that
maybe
I
this
had.
could be our last point because I have to go as well.
Oh, okay, yeah. So I'll just say this. We can kind of move on. But so God has knowledge moreover of himself, or that is to say, God comprehends himself. He knows himself as far as he is knowable, that is, infinitely. His intellect, however, is not a faculty like ours, which would be distinct from its act and from its object. So, in other words, God is self-subsistent with his act of understanding. God's existence and the things that he knows are ontologically similar with one another, in other words. And so his actual thinking, which isn't accidental, but it's substantial, it has to do with his being. It's identical with his substance. It's kind of getting to this idea of what Aristotle says, that God is an understanding of understanding, or an unmixed intellectual splendor. What does he say? Splendor,
I'm sorry,
eternally
what?
self-subsistent, something like that. But sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. It's just like lofty words, but I think like the point is still evading me. I'm not understanding what you're saying.
Yeah, God only has knowledge of himself. God cannot have knowledge of things that are outside of him. So God really only has knowledge in two ways: a simple knowledge, which is like knowledge of things that are, and what's called a knowledge of approbation. So a knowledge of things that he permits. So in other words, can God have knowledge of evil or of sin? Well, no, because these are not realities. These are privations of being. So God only knows these things, these acts, in light of what he permits or what he actually is. And so history, his unfolding of knowledge, if you want to call it that, is just really this unfolding of his creative act, which wasn't something that took place 6,000 years ago in the Garden of Eden, yada, yada, yada. God's creative act is something that it's kind of once and for all, but yet continual in a kind of way.
It doesn't matter how far back you go, 6,000 or 60,000, right? There has to be some point where if he knew all along the way until the beginning of time or whatever, if he knew what are the choices that I'm going to make, which seems to be applied by omniscience, then I cannot do anything. I can work 24 hours a day and not save my job if he knows that I'm going to quit my job. So where's the freedom there?
I think so. What's interesting too, that I'm thinking about this. So first and foremost, we could talk about distinctions in God's decreeing will. So we could talk about like how God actually determines and has a kind of declaration in his will whereby he'll say this will happen, or he has a kind of will where he kind of interacts with human affairs and permits things to happen. But notice that those distinctions that we could talk about are only relevant within a religious context. There is nothing by way of philosophical knowledge that could afford us like a science of distinctions or a detailed way to map out how God's knowledge works. We could explore it philosophically, but the bulk of that is going to happen on religious grounds, if you will.
I mean, so that's the thing. The reason why this happens in the religious domain is because religious people are the one who postulate things like all-knowing and all-merciful and all these things. On a philosophical basis or like just on a basis of naturalistic pantheism, there is no need to create any sort of like omniscient God or something.
Yeah, but I think what that solution resorts to is basically impersonality. It's not a personal. So in other words, if we're even talking about the universe existing now, it's because it has the possibility of not existing. There must be some prime mover, some initial mind that intended for the universe to be. But there's nothing to suggest under naturalistic pantheism that this ground of reality or this ground of being has any causal power in that kind of way. So that's why I think that's a problem, because abstract.
Why do you think that's a problem? Why can't physical things have a cause and effect relationship? They do all the time.
They absolutely do. But I'm suggesting that there is still a first cause, that stands at the beginning of this chain of efficient causes. So sure. I think there's often a confusion among certain atheistic objections that God is the sort of continual efficient cause, as if God causes every single event to occur in a direct kind of way. It's not so much the case. it's almost as if you could think of God, like a billiard game. You hit the white ball, and all the balls kind of, I guess there's 8 or 9, however many that scatter along the table. So you could see God's initial act proceeding from the divine essence, hitting the created order. And you can see this scattering now as being infinitely varying. So even though there's an intentionality on God's part, there's still this collaboration between intentionality and causal effects. But those causal effects are not a part of that initial act initially or directly. I mean, does that make sense?
So I see, like what you're saying is the intentionality, and I think like those are the two problems in philosophy. I don't want to drift into hard problem of consciousness, etc. But the intentionality that you're saying is there is no need for intentionality for the all-powerful nature, which is the naturalistic pantheism. I mean, it could have just been an all-powerful nature that always existed, and it led to a chain of events that led to emergent properties that led to the sun, our universe, and us, and so on.
Yeah.
I think so you don't need intentionality for that.
Yeah. Pardon my interruption. So I think one of the strongest arguments, in my opinion, is a kind of cosmological argument. Not that says, okay, the universe began at X point, therefore that needs a cause. I would look to this general feature in the universe that things have this possibility of not being otherwise. But the fact that things are suggests that there is some causal relation that's dictating their being. And so because we have a difference or a distinction between is and is not, this presupposes the existence of something that simply is.
Yes, and that could be the all-powerful nature. It simply is.
Absolutely. But now we've conceded also to a distinction between this is and the other things which have this distinction, is and is not. So in other words, this ground of reality is not synonymous with the effects it brings about. Does that make sense?
Sure.
So that's what kind of gets me to this idea of a personalistic mind, is that we have a reality that is separate or independent entirely in being from the rest of created things, but also creates or causes those things to be, and sustains
I'm sorry, I might have misspoken. So for sustenance, you just need the energy, right? Like, so there is the flow of energy from one thing to the other that leads to emergent properties. So it's not completely coherent for even a deistic God, for example, right? Who just creates and forgets about it. Just like the billiards ball, all you have to do is that initial hitting with the cue ball, and everything else takes care of itself. So you don't need someone to continuously sustain something or anything. But I don't think I concede that this fundamental nature of reality, this all-powerful nature, is separate from our reality. It is within this reality. It's just that it's uncreated. It always existed.
Yeah. I mean, so if that's going to be the metaphysical conclusion, then I would say it's no surprise you're an atheist, because
that's the reason why I don't ascribe to one conclusion or the other. I stay agnostic to it. The only reason of me saying this is possible, or this is the one metaphysical conclusion that you can arrive at, is because it's logically coherent, and there is no reason for, and because I think it's a better hypothesis than the God hypothesis, because this doesn't add another ontology on top of nature itself. To add another ontology on top of nature, something like a conscious God who's omniscient, is infinitely less parsimonious. So I think we should just reject it.
But see, that's my problem with the move of philosophers, is that what I'm hearing is not, okay, what needs to be there is this extra ontology. And if this ontology was there, notice the consequences of what that would entail. I mean, I'm talking about a real active relationship by which you carry your moral life and how you understand your death. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. I think there's a responsibility, a kind of moral expectation, a moral possibility on your behalf that I guess isn't being so much appreciated in this ontological conversation that we're having. I think there's a shifting off of existential burdens that come with accepting belief in God.
I think that'll be a great topic to talk next time. I think I enjoyed this conversation, but I gotta go. And I think maybe we can explore some of the existential questions and how it accords with morality and the way you live your life. What are the implications of a God versus no God? Maybe that's something we can talk about.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would love to, yeah.
Yeah, no, bless your time. As I mentioned before, thank you so much for your patience. Waiting
no
for me
problem.
when I first came in, and then 2 storms. I'm so sorry, but
No, I understand how frustrating these technical issues could be, but yeah, I was not doing anything. You're
bless
good.
you, bless
Thanks,
you.
Steven.
Okay, yes, sir. Thank you, and I think that that settles it. So we just
Yeah, it was
log
quite
out,
a
I
treat.
guess.
Thank you.
All right, brother. Have a good
Bye.
one.